All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep, really deep, into a question that I think a lot of folks might not even think to ask.
Yeah.
We're talking about Yahweh, the God of the Bible,
Right.
and Allah, the God of the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
Are they the same? Are we talking about one God with two different names?
Yeah, it's a question that comes up, and it makes sense that it comes up because, you've got these Abrahamic religions, they have so much in common.
Exactly.
They've got a lot of the same figures, a lot of the same stories.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a natural question to ask, well, are we all just talking about the same God, just using different terms?
Yeah, especially for folks outside of those traditions. I think it's easy to just lump it all together.
Right, exactly.
But you've sent over some fascinating material that really digs into this.
Yeah.
And it pushes back pretty hard against that assumption.
It does.
So I'm excited to unpack this. What's the main argument that we're going to be exploring in this deep dive?
Well, the core argument here is that when you actually look at the characteristics, the attributes, the nature of Yahweh versus the nature of Allah, as they're presented in their respective scriptures, you find some pretty fundamental differences, especially when it comes to ideas like goodness, truth,
Right.
and even the way that sovereignty is understood.
I see. So it's not just they're both all-powerful, therefore they must be the same, but there's more nuance.
A lot more nuance. Yeah, it's not just about power, but it's about the nature of that power and how it's expressed.
Okay, that's a great way to put it. So let's get into it.
Let's do it.
I want to start with Yahweh, the God of the Bible.
Okay.
The material you sent really highlighted this idea that Yahweh is inherently good and truthful.
Yeah, absolutely.
What were some of the things that stuck out to you about how the sources presented that?
One of the things that really jumped out at me was how specific scriptural passages are used to make the point that these attributes are not just things that God does, but that they're actually part of who he is.
Right.
It's not that he just chooses to be truthful. It's that he can't lie.
Right.
And that's a really big difference. So, for example, in Numbers 23.1, Diane, it says, God is not a man that he should lie.
Mm-hmm.
And in Titus 1.2, it says, God who cannot lie.
Wow. Okay.
You see it right there in the text.
Yeah. It's almost like saying a square cannot have five sides.
Exactly. It's like it's built into his very nature.
Like it's not a limitation.
No, it's a definition.
It's a definition.
Okay.
That makes sense. So truth is part of his essence.
Right. And the same goes for goodness.
Okay.
So you've got Psalm 34.8, which says, oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. And then you have James 1.17, which says, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change.
That's a powerful image. It's this idea that God's goodness, like his truthfulness,
is unchanging. It's constant. It's not subject to whims or fluctuations.
Yeah.
It's just who he is at his core.
Okay, so this brings us to a concept that the source mentions called divine simplicity.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, when I first saw that term, my eyes kind of glazed over.
I can understand that.
It sounds really technical.
Yeah.
So can you break it down for us?
Sure. So divine simplicity is this idea that God's attributes, like his goodness, his truth, his justice, his mercy, they're not separate parts of him.
Okay.
They're not like add-ons. They're not like, he's got this much justice and this much mercy.
Right.
It's that they are all one and the same thing with his essence.
Gotcha. So it's not that he has goodness, it's that he is goodness.
Exactly. So you can't separate them out. They're all completely intertwined and unified.
I see.
And that's why, theologically speaking, it's impossible for God to be evil because evil is understood as the absence of good.
Right.
And if his essence is goodness, then evil is just not something that can be part of him.
It's like darkness. It's the absence of light. It's not a thing itself.
Precisely.
And the source, I think, really drives that point home with a quote from Isaiah 5.20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil.
Yeah. And that really highlights that for Yahweh, there is an absolute standard of goodness.
Okay, so we've laid out this picture of Yahweh, where truth and goodness are woven into his very fabric.
Right.
But now let's turn to Allah.
Okay.
The source material makes a case that while both Yahweh and Allah are seen as all-powerful, the nature of their power, how it's described, is actually really different.
It is, yeah.
And with Allah, there's this emphasis on his absolute unrestricted will.
Yes.
It's almost like it seems that his will can even override morality as we understand it.
That's a very important point.
What are some of the scriptural examples that the source uses to illustrate this?
So one that really stands out is from Surah 3.54 of the Quran. And it describes Allah as, and this is in the context of a plan against people who are opposed to Jesus, it describes Allah as the best of deceivers.
Whoa, okay.
Now, that phrase in Arabic is khair al-makirin, and the word makir can have a few different shades of meaning.
Right.
It can mean deceiver, but it can also mean planner or schemer.
Okay, so there's some room for interpretation there.
There is. And some Islamic scholars interpret this as Allah just being the ultimate strategist, that he's always one step ahead. But the sources that we're looking at, they really focus on that more literal meaning of deception.
Right, because that's not a word that we typically associate with a being of ultimate goodness, right?
Right, and that's the big point. It's a very different way of thinking about God than what you see in the Bible.
Yeah, it's thought-provoking. So are there any other verses that highlight this idea of Allah's will kind of overriding what we might consider moral limitations?
Yeah, definitely. So in Surah 14.4, it says, Allah sends astray whom he wills and guides whom he wills. And the argument here is that this isn't just God allowing people to make their own choices, and sometimes those choices lead them astray.
Right.
It's that he is actively involved in sending people astray.
I see. So it's not a passive thing, it's an active thing.
Right. It's all part of his plan.
And this, again, is a big departure from how Yahweh is typically portrayed.
It is.
Where his guidance is always connected to goodness and truth.
Right. Exactly. And there's another one, a hadith from Sahih Muslim 2657b,
okay,
where the Prophet Muhammad is quoted as saying, Allah has created some people for hell.
Wow, okay.
And that's a pretty strong statement. It suggests predestination, that some people are just created for damnation,
right,
regardless of what they do in life.
And this, again, contrasts with, the Judeo-Christian idea that God wants everyone to be saved.
Absolutely. And that he gives us free will to choose.
Choose our path, yeah.
Right. But in Islamic theology, this idea of predestination isn't necessarily seen as unjust.
Okay, so how do they reconcile that with the concept of a just God?
Because the idea is that Allah's will itself defines what is just.
So whatever he wills is by definition just.
Exactly. It's not about aligning with some external standard of justice that we humans might come up with.
Right.
It's about what God decides.
Okay, that's a really different framework for morality.
It is. And this is a point that was really emphasized by the scholar Al-Ghazali.
Okay.
He basically said that it's almost blasphemous to try to put any kind of moral limitations on Allah,
right,
because that would be limiting his absolute sovereignty.
So it's not that Allah is bound by morality,
right,
but that his will determines what's moral.
Exactly. And we see this idea further in Surah 6.39, which talks about Allah hardening the hearts of those whom he wills to leave astray.
So again, very active involvement.
Very active. He's not just watching things unfold, he's directing them.
Okay, so let's recap for a second.
Okay.
We have this really stark contrast emerging.
We do.
On one hand, Yahweh, inherently good and truthful, incapable of evil.
Yes.
On the other hand, Allah, absolute sovereignty. His will is the ultimate authority.
Right.
What are some of the big theological and philosophical implications of this difference?
Well, the source makes a really interesting point. He says that if Allah can do anything, including things that we would consider evil, then in a way, his capacity in that realm surpasses even Satan's.
That's a huge statement.
It is.
But explain that. How does that work?
So in Christian theology, Satan is the ultimate deceiver.
All right.
Right. Revelation 12.9 calls him the deceiver of the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
But his power is limited.
Okay.
He can tempt, he can lie, he can deceive, but he can't force anyone to do anything.
Right. And ultimately, he's rebelling against God's will.
Yeah, exactly. He's not working with God, he's working against him.
Right.
But if Allah can do anything, if his will is the ultimate arbiter of good and evil, then his capacity for deception, his capacity to bring about what we might consider negative outcomes
actually exceeds Satan's?
I see.
Because it's not limited by any external moral constraints.
So the source is leading us to this question.
Yeah.
Can these two beings with such different natures really be the same God?
Right. And the source's answer is a resounding no.
Okay.
It says they're just too fundamentally different.
And to really bolster this point, the source brings in some pretty heavy-duty philosophical arguments.
But it does.
One that I found really interesting was Anselm's definition of God.
Oh, yeah.
He talks about God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived.
Right.
So how does the source connect this idea to the Yahweh-Allah discussion?
It argues that Yahweh, because he is inherently good and truthful, fits this definition perfectly.
Okay.
Because a being who is all-powerful and also perfectly good, that's the ultimate, the greatest being you can imagine.
You can't really conceive of anything greater than that.
Exactly.
But with Allah, the emphasis is more on this unrestricted will.
It's absolute power, which is a different kind of greatness.
It is. It's a greatness that's not necessarily tied to our human ideas of morality.
Right. And this brings us to another concept, voluntarism.
Yeah.
The source mentions Ibn Hazm and his view on this. Can you unpack that for us?
Sure. So voluntarism is this idea that God's will is the ultimate source of everything, including morality.
Okay.
So for someone like Ibn Hazm, an action is good or bad, just or unjust, simply because God wills it.
So there's no independent standard?
No. It's all about what God decides.
Okay.
And this means that actions that would be completely unthinkable for Yahweh, like, for example, some interpretations of Surah 9.5 in the Quran, which talks about violence against non-believers,
Right.
Those actions could be considered just and righteous within this voluntarist framework.
Because God willed them.
Exactly. And that's a really key difference in how morality is understood in these two traditions.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about theory. Let's get into some concrete examples.
Sure.
The source provides a couple of practical comparisons
Yeah, it does.
to really illustrate these contrasting natures.
Right.
The first one focuses on the idea of justice,
Yeah.
and it looks at how Abraham interacts with God in each tradition.
Right.
So let's start with the biblical account.
Okay.
What happens there?
So in Genesis 18.25, you have Abraham pleading with Yahweh about the impending destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he says, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?"
And that's a bold question.
It is. He's basically questioning God's justice.
Right.
But what's amazing is that Yahweh doesn't get angry.
Yeah.
He listens to Abraham, and he agrees to spare the cities if even a small number of righteous people can be found there.
So there's this dialogue, this back and forth.
Yes.
It implies that there's a shared understanding of justice.
Right. It's not just about God's arbitrary will. It's about righteousness, about fairness.
Okay, so now let's contrast that with the Quranic example.
So the source points to Surah 7.179, which says that Allah has created a multitude of beings for hell.
Okay.
And there's no appeal to justice here.
Right.
There's no sense that these beings did something to deserve this fate.
So it's presented as entirely predetermined.
Yes. It's just Allah's will.
And there's no questioning it.
No, not really. It's just presented as a fact.
Okay, that's a pretty significant difference.
It is. One emphasizes a God who is bound by justice.
Right.
Who can be reasoned with, who can be questioned.
And the other emphasizes a God whose will is ultimate.
Right.
Even if it seems to contradict our human ideas of fairness.
Exactly.
Okay, the second practical example that the source gives focuses on love and enmity.
Yeah.
Let's start with the biblical side.
Okay.
What's the example there?
The source highlights Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5.44 to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
And that's a pretty radical teaching even today.
It is. It goes against our natural human instinct.
To love those who hurt us, yeah.
Right. But that's the kind of love that Yahweh embodies, love that extends to everyone, even his enemies.
Okay, so that's the standard set by Yahweh.
Right.
What's the Quranic counterpart to that?
The source points to Surah 60.4, which talks about Abraham renouncing idolatry.
Okay.
And in this passage it says, "There has already been for you a good example in Abraham and those with him, when they said to their people, 'Indeed, we are disassociated from you and from whatever you worship other than Allah. We have denied you, and there has appeared between us and you animosity and hatred forever until you believe in Allah alone.'"
Wow, okay, so that's quite a different message.
It is. It's emphasizing separation, animosity, hatred towards those who don't share the same belief.
And this is presented as a good thing.
It's presented as the example set by Abraham.
Okay, so we have Yahweh, whose love is universal.
Yeah.
And Allah, who, at least in this passage, seems to command a kind of perpetual enmity towards those who are different.
Exactly.
So given all of these differences, why does this distinction between Yahweh and Allah really matter?
Well, the source argues that the way we understand God has a huge impact on our morality.
Okay, how so?
If you believe in a God who is inherently good, then morality flows from that goodness.
Right, there's a fixed standard.
Exactly.
Lying is wrong because God is truthful.
Right.
Injustice is wrong because God is just.
Exactly.
But if your God is defined by absolute will, and his will determines what's right and wrong,
yes,
then morality becomes a lot more fluid.
it does. It becomes dependent on what God commands, not on some inherent standard.
And those commands could potentially change.
They could.
Or they could seem contradictory to us.
Right. And that's where things get really tricky.
And the source circles back to that comparison with Satan.
Yeah.
For Judeo-Christians, Satan is the epitome of evil, but he's limited.
Yes.
But if Allah's will can encompass actions that we see as evil,
right,
then his capacity for those actions is greater than Satan's.
Exactly. Because it's not constrained by anything.
And this is where I think a lot of people in the West, especially those with a Judeo-Christian background, might struggle.
Yeah, I think so. Because we just assume that God has to be good.
Right. It's such a fundamental part of our worldview.
Absolutely. But in Islam, it's different.
Okay.
The source points out that even suggesting that Allah can't do something, even something we might see as evil, can be seen as blasphemous.
So you can't limit his power,
right,
even with morality.
Exactly. And Al-Ghazali really emphasizes this in his writings on the 99 beautiful names of God.
So let's bring it all together.
Okay.
What's the main takeaway from this deep dive?
The main takeaway is that, according to these sources, Yahweh and Allah are not the same God.
Okay.
They have fundamentally different natures.
Right. Yahweh defined by inherent goodness and truth.
Yes.
Allah defined by absolute, unrestricted sovereignty.
Exactly.
And this isn't just some abstract theological debate.
No.
It has real-world implications.
It shapes how people understand morality, how they live their lives, how they view the world.
Right. It impacts their entire worldview.
Absolutely.
So for you listening out there, I want to leave you with this.
Okay.
Think about what it means to believe in a God whose core nature is either absolute goodness or absolute will.
Right.
How would that shape your life?
Yeah, it's a big question.
Your choices.
Absolutely.
Your relationships.
Yeah.
Your understanding of the universe.
It's a question that deserves some real reflection.
It does. It's something to really ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.